Emily's last night of freedom began with the muffled sound of dry leaves being crushed under her feet. She walked through the empty city streets, her heart pounding, beating like a drum, announcing her own sentence. In the background, the imposing silhouette of a corporate building rose against the night sky, reflecting the bright city lights that seemed to mock her misery. Emily was just a 19-year-old girl with big dreams and a courage born from the desperate need to save the man she loved most, her father. Weeks ago, he had been gravely ill, and the doctors had been clear. Without immediate treatment, he wouldn't survive. She tried everything: loans, help from friends. She even considered selling what little she had, but nothing was enough. Then an insane offer came from a man she never imagined she would have to confront. The ruthless CEO of Kellington Industries, Alexander Kellington. Alexander was a man known for his harshness and coldness. He rarely let himself be seen outside his glass and steel tower, and the stories about him were chilling. He controlled not only the company's fortune, but the lives of everyone around him. His offer was simple and terrifying. One night with him in exchange for the treatment his father needed to live. She knew she had no choice. Her father was dying, and Alexander knew it. The words he used were like a death sentence that she accepted without hesitation, even though her body and soul wanted to scream in revolt. To him, she was nothing more than a commodity that could be bought and consumed. A piece in his cruel game. That night, when Emily arrived at the Kellington mansion, she felt the weight of what she was about to do, but there was no turning back. The man who awaited her at the top of the stairs, with cold, calculating eyes, offered no words of comfort. He simply observed her, as if she were a commodity in a shop window. "This is the price of your father's treatment," he said, his voice deep and uncompromising. With a heavy sigh, she entered the mansion. The lights went out, and darkness swallowed her. With each step she took, the feeling of losing something more than her dignity grew within her. But what she didn't know was that this night would mark only the beginning of an endless cycle, where each night would leave her more lost, more insatiable. Not just for him, for both of them. Emily's world was simple before that night. She grew up in a small town where the streets were quiet and life seemed to follow a tranquil rhythm. Her father, a tireless worker, had always been the pillar of her existence. He had sacrificed everything for her since her mother passed away when she was just a child. Emily saw him as a hero, always smiling despite the difficulties he faced. But with his illness, that simple life shattered, and the reality that she could no longer protect her father alone forced her to resort to her last resort. Kellington's mansion was an entity apart. It was impossible to pass by the avenue without feeling the weight of its presence, a tall, cold building of glass and steel that resembled a fortress. And there, at the top of the corporate pyramid, was Alexander Kellington. His story was known to all, but its details were shrouded in mystery. He grew up in a wealthy and powerful family, but unlike many heirs, Alexander was not content to simply maintain the family fortune. He wanted more. He wanted control, absolute power. He was never seen as approachable or friendly. His name was whispered in the corridors of large corporations as synonymous with a ruthless, calculating, and for many, feared individual. But what few knew was that behind the facade of an infallible CEO, there was a man marked by loneliness. Alexander possessed an insatiable obsession with control, which wasn't limited to the business world. He sought dominance in his personal relationships, and this made him a difficult man to deal with. No woman could stay by his side for long. He pushed them away with the weight of his indifference and his power. For him, others were pieces that moved on the board, and Emily would soon become just another one. On the first night Emily met him, he was even more distant than she had imagined. His presence was overwhelming, like a predator who already knew what he was going to do. He observed her for long seconds, as if assessing her, before a word was spoken. He didn't treat her like a desperate young woman. To him, she was a business transaction, a fair exchange, and that empty gaze was the first of many moments when she would realize that, to him, she was nothing more than another whim. Their interactions were rigid, cold, but in a way that felt electrically charged. Each night Emily felt more lost, as if she were being absorbed by an insatiable, endless machine. At first, she tried to resist, but it soon became clear that each day her struggle grew emptier, and Alexander's behavior became more possessive. He never forced her, but his presence was so dominant that it seemed he was always controlling her actions, manipulating events with a skill she didn't fully understand. In the mansion, everything seemed to exist to maintain Alexander's ruthless order. The surroundings were always impeccable, but something about it always gave the feeling that there was more there than just a simple house. It was a place of perfect appearances, but with a constant unease beneath the surface. The nights were silent, almost oppressive, but Alexander's eyes never seemed to tire of observing. He wanted more than she could offer, and worse, he was becoming increasingly obsessed. But Emily was changing too. As they spent more nights together, she began to understand that however hopeless her situation seemed, she couldn't simply give in without a fight. Something inside her was still rebelling, but what exactly she was trying to save was no longer clear. Her father, her soul, or something even deeper. She didn't know, but what she did know was that the more she yielded to his power, the harder it would be to escape. Each night, the tension between Emily and Alexander seemed to increase. The exchange of a single night for an uncertain future was becoming something more complex, something she couldn't control. Initially, she thought she could endure it, that this sacrifice would keep her going longer. But the nights dragged on, and what had once seemed like a bargain with a clear price now seemed like an endless trap. On the third night, Alexander suggested something Emily had never imagined. He invited her to a social event, a gala hosted by Kellington Industries, where all the magnates and figures of power gathered. Reluctantly, she accepted. It was a new kind of challenge, a new test of the control he had over her. There, in the luxurious and superficial atmosphere, she felt for the first time the weight of the situation she had gotten herself into. Alexander's coldness was evident even in the smallest gestures. The way he guided her through the hall, as if he were displaying her like a piece from his collection, was disconcerting. She tried to hide behind a forced smile, but her astonished eyes couldn't ignore the curious glances and whispered comments around her. It was a suffocating feeling of being at the mercy of something bigger than herself, something that made her feel insignificant. Alexander, on the other hand, seemed to be enjoying himself, observing the reactions of others as if watching a game unfold. But there was a coldness in his gaze, an intensity that Emily couldn't fully understand. He didn't care about what she felt, nor about the consequences of his actions. He simply played, moving the pieces on the board meticulously. That night, something inside Emily began to change. What had previously seemed like a choice between saving her father and maintaining her dignity now seemed like a series of smaller choices, each pushing her toward an even more desperate situation. Alexander wasn't just using her for his own needs. He was dominating her in ways she couldn't comprehend, manipulating her feelings and morality with frightening skill. The morning after the party, Emily woke up in her guest room at the mansion, feeling emptier than ever. Her mind was a jumble of conflicting thoughts, but one thing was clear. She was losing herself. The man she had known in the early nights, distant and calculating, was now becoming more present, more oppressive. The nights had turned into an endless cycle of sacrifices, where the line between pleasure and suffering became increasingly blurred. With each passing night, Alexander's need for her became more evident. He didn't just want her company, he wanted to control her, to make her bend to his will. He didn't force her directly, but his actions, his gestures, were so insidious that she could no longer distinguish where her choice began and his manipulation ended. He challenged her, tested her limits, and with each challenge, Emily found herself more trapped in the web he had woven around her. It was as if he knew exactly what to say, how to move the pieces to make her give in more and more. He didn't need to shout or be aggressive. The silence of his presence, the icy gaze, and the growing expectation were enough to keep Emily in a constant state of tension. She was beginning to realize that she was becoming a hostage to an obsession she barely understood, but which somehow she also felt. Her internal struggle grew each day as she tried to cling to something, anything, that would make her feel human again. At the same time, her father was growing weaker and weaker. His recovery depended on the money Alexander had promised, but with each passing day, Emily wondered if the treatment was truly saving her father's life, or if she had been deceived all along. Doubt hung over her like a dark cloud, making each night more unbearable. While Alexander seemed to enjoy the situation, Emily struggled to understand what he truly wanted. He had never treated her kindly, never considered her more than a means to an end. But there was something about his presence that both attracted and repelled her, something that made her feel as if she were being sucked in by an invisible, relentless force. She knew she was losing herself, but she didn't know how to escape. Time seemed to drag on cruelly for Emily. Each night stretched like a sentence, and with each dawn, the feeling of being consumed by something bigger than herself intensified. But there was more at stake than she initially realized. As Emily's internal struggle deepened, her interactions with others around Kellington became more revealing. The mansion, once merely a stage for Alexander's dominance, began to transform into a place where secrets were guarded with the same care as the most valuable jewels. The maids, always discreet, cast pitying glances as they passed her. The few guests who appeared for the gala dinners seemed to look at Emily as if she were part of a grotesque spectacle, but she no longer cared about the stares. Her world was being reduced to two things: the nights with Alexander and the weeks her father spent fighting for his life. It was then that she began to perceive the subtleties of Alexander's behavior. He wasn't just controlling her physically, there was something deeper and more ingrained in his actions. He used words and gestures as a form of psychological manipulation. Instead of forcing her, he made her believe she was in control, that the decision to continue was exclusively hers. But with each passing night, Emily felt more and more a prisoner of her own choices, more trapped in a web she could no longer understand. However, there was something she didn't know. Alexander was also hiding his own secrets. During one of their brief conversations, Emily discovered through a seemingly casual piece of information that he hadn't grown up with the privileges he imagined. Alexander had come from a childhood marked by pain and loneliness. His father, a ruthless business magnate, treated him with the same coldness with which he now treated everyone around him. Hearing this, Emily didn't know if what she felt was pity or a new understanding of that cruel man. Meanwhile, her father's situation was becoming increasingly serious. The treatment she had received as payment for her nights with Alexander seemed to be working, but something deep in her mind told her it might not be enough. She spent days in a kind of torpor, alternating between moments with Alexander and moments trying to hold on to hope for her father. But with each step she took outside the mansion, the feeling of growing further away from him intensified. Emily's isolation worsened as reality became more difficult to face. She felt as if she were in a gilded cage where her decisions were limited by the need to keep her father alive, but where she was also being slowly consumed by Alexander's oppressive presence. Then one night, a new figure appeared at the mansion. It was a woman who seemed out of place, but who carried with her an air of familiarity with Alexander. Her name was Rebecca, an old childhood friend of Kellington's. Her presence was a surprise to both Emily and Alexander, who seemed uneasy about her arrival. Rebecca, however, didn't seem so impressed by Alexander's power. She looked at Emily with a mixture of compassion and curiosity, as if she already knew what was happening. In the early days of their interaction, Rebecca tried to get closer to Emily, offering her words of comfort, though her approach was disguised as superficial interest. But Emily soon realized there was something disconcerting about the relationship between the two. Rebecca wasn't just a friend from the past. She seemed to understand Alexander's behavior much better than Emily had imagined. More than that, Rebecca seemed to have a connection with him that went beyond friendship. There was something in their gaze, something Emily couldn't decipher. This new dynamic brought a sense of urgency to Emily. She didn't know who to trust more, Alexander, whose obsession seemed endless, or Rebecca, who, despite being a potential ally, also seemed to be hiding something. Each night with Alexander became more complex as new doubts and revelations began to emerge. As time dragged on, the pieces of the puzzle seemed to fall into place in an increasingly agonizing way. Emily wondered how much longer she could withstand the pressure of a situation that seemed endless. But at the same time, doubt about Alexander's intentions and the role Rebecca played in it all kept her constantly on edge. She knew that deep down everything was heading towards something she didn't yet fully understand. One thing was certain. With each passing night, Alexander's control over her life became more absolute. But he was also about to face something that not even he could control, something Emily couldn't yet foresee. The night arrived colder than usual. The Kellington mansion was silent, the kind of silence that precedes something big, something inevitable. Emily felt it in every fiber of her being, a growing pressure, as if the air were charged with electricity about to explode at any moment. In the previous days, she had tried to escape the growing feeling that something was about to change. But each night, the truth became more impossible to ignore. Alexander seemed to sense this too, but he didn't care. He was in control, or at least he thought he was. Dinner was over, and Emily was preparing for another of her nights with him. But something in her mind was different, clearer. She no longer wanted to be just a pawn in Alexander's game. Something inside her had broken, an emotional barrier that had previously prevented her from rebelling. She was tired of submitting, tired of being an object. But what to do? What could she do when there was no escape? It was then, just as she was about to enter Alexander's office, that an unexpected figure appeared in the doorway. Rebecca. She was pale, with eyes more serious than Emily had ever seen her in before. The woman, usually so composed and sophisticated, seemed disturbed, as if she were in shock. "You need to listen to what I'm going to say," Rebecca said, her voice deeper than usual. "Now is not the time to be with him, Emily. It's not what you think." Those words hit her like a slap in the face. Emily looked at her, surprised and confused. But before she could question her, Rebecca continued, "I know what you're going through, and I know what he did, what he's doing. But you need to understand that there's more at stake than you realize. Alexander isn't just cruel. He's trying to get revenge." "Avenge what?" Emily asked, feeling a wave of discomfort run down her spine. Rebecca hesitated before speaking, as if weighing her words. "From his own father, the story he never told anyone. The truth he's hiding, Emily, the way you're treating your father, this money he promised, it's not a simple exchange. Alexander is doing this for a much more personal reason, and he's been manipulating you all along, not just now, but from the very beginning." Emily took a step back, trying to process what she had just heard. Her mind was spinning, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fit together in a disconcerting way. What Rebecca was saying didn't make sense. Why would Alexander, if he were truly vengeful, be offering help to her father? But then, a terrible idea surged in her mind. What if he was doing this to gain control over her, to keep the situation under his control once again? Are you saying he never really wanted to save my father? Emily asked, her voice almost breaking as a knot formed in her stomach. Rebecca approached slowly, her gaze firm and sorrowful. I don't know what's going through your head right now, Emily. But you have to understand that what's happening isn't just a negotiation of body and soul. He's using you, not only to get revenge for something that happened in the past, but also to amuse himself with your suffering. He's playing a much darker game than you imagine. The revelation left her breathless. The ground seemed to open up beneath her feet. The manipulation she felt during her nights with Alexander, the small doses of power he exerted over her, now seemed to have a much deeper and more perverse meaning. He wasn't just a cold and calculating man. He was, in some way, taking revenge, and the central piece in this game was herself. Before Emily could formulate a response, Alexander's footsteps echoed down the hallway. He appeared in the doorway, his gaze fixed and unforgiving. The tension in the air was instantaneous, as if his arrival were the trigger for a bomb about to explode. "What are you doing here, Rebecca?" he asked, his voice sharp. Rebecca didn't hesitate. She faced him with a courage Emily never knew she possessed. "I'm trying to stop you from destroying another person's life, Alexander. You won't play games with her like you did with me. Not anymore." Alexander's gaze shifted for a moment, a fraction of a second in which his humanity, until then hidden, was visible. But soon he reverted to being the man Emily knew. Cold, calculating, without empathy. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice lower and more threatening. Rebecca, however, was not intimidated. "You can't continue with this. She's no longer a pawn in your game. She's a person." The silence that followed was almost deafening. Emily looked at Rebecca, then at Alexander. What to do now? She was faced with a choice that could change everything: continue in the web of manipulation that Alexander had created, or take control of her own life, perhaps destroying everything he had built. That's when she made a decision. She wasn't going to be just a puppet anymore. Her game was about to begin. The air was tense, thick like a curtain closing in on the room. The silence after the confrontation seemed eternal. Emily felt her heart pounding in her chest, a thunderous sound amidst the menacing silence that dominated the mansion. She knew that nothing would be the same after that night. Rebecca had been her ally, but the decision she was now making was not one she could undo. When she looked at Alexander, she saw the coldness he always displayed. But something else was there too, something that resembled anger, perhaps even despair. He wasn't used to losing control, and now it seemed he was finally beginning to realize that Emily was no longer a pawn in his game. "Do you really think you can change the rules now, Emily?" Alexander asked, his voice a menacing whisper. He approached slowly, and his gaze, which had previously been calculated cruelty, now carried something more, a need to regain control over her. But Emily didn't back down. She had crossed a line. "I've made my decision, Alexander. I'm no longer part of your game. I'm no longer your pawn to move whenever and however you want." Her words were clear, but inside she felt a wave of anxiety. What would happen now? She was defying the man who held power over her life and her father's. But an unknown force propelled her, something within her that was tired of being manipulated, tired of being controlled by someone who fed on the pain of others. Alexander stood silent for a moment, assessing her. Time seemed to slow down as he reflected on what she had just said. Then, surprisingly, he took a step back. His face remained impassive, but his treacherous eyes betrayed a flash of something Emily couldn't fully understand. Perhaps a distorted admiration or a forced respect for someone who had finally dared to resist. "I thought you were easier to control," he said, his voice softer now, almost disinterested. "But of course you're more complicated than I imagined." Emily didn't know if he was trying to destabilize her with those words, or if he was truly beginning to understand that she was no longer someone he could dominate with simple manipulations. But, whatever it was, what she most desired at that moment was for him to leave, for his pressure to cease. "I am no longer your property, Alexander, and you will realize that even if I cannot save my father, I have something you will never have: freedom." He looked at her once more, a disdainful expression on his face, but also something more. It was as if, realizing he had lost control, he was preparing for something even darker. Emily didn't know what he would do next, but she knew that by challenging him, the only certainty was that the war between them had truly begun. The following morning, she learned he was planning something. Alexander wasn't the type of man to accept defeat without reacting. He was cruel, yes, but also intelligent enough to understand that losing his possession, his puppet, was a blow he couldn't let pass unpunished. Emily still didn't know how he would retaliate, but the tension she felt kept her on edge. Her life was about to change again, and she didn't know if the next step would be the freedom she so desperately craved or something even more devastating. Meanwhile, her father was beginning to respond to the treatment. The improvements were small, but visible. She knew that somehow the effort she was making to keep the promises Alexander had made was working. But deep down, she could no longer ignore that there was something wrong with those promises. What did he really want? What was behind this help? Rebecca had also distanced herself, but in an enigmatic way. She hadn't returned to the mansion, but Emily felt closer to her than ever. It was as if Rebecca had left a mark on her mind, a feeling that something was still to come. Perhaps she knew more about Alexander's true nature than Emily imagined, and deep down, Emily felt that the woman had become an ally, even if a shadow of doubt still lingered about her intentions. As the day went on, the pressure on Emily only increased. She knew her choices were only beginning to make waves, and that the consequences would creep in like a relentless tide. She was willing to pay the price, but what she didn't yet know was how deep that tide could truly sink her. The sun shone brightly that morning, but Emily could barely feel the warmth. She sat by the mansion's pool, her feet immersed in the cold water. Her mind, however, was elsewhere, navigating a sea of thoughts and feelings she could no longer control. The decision she had made the previous night had marked her irrevocably, and now every step she took seemed to weigh more heavily. The battle with Alexander was far from over, but one thing was clear: she would not back down. In the following days, her interactions with Alexander became even more tense. He watched her with a sharper gaze, almost as if he were waiting for her to make a mistake. Her every move was meticulously analyzed, and she felt for the first time the magnitude of the power he still held over her. But instead of giving in, Emily transformed. Each contemptuous word from Alexander, each piercing look, only reinforced her determination. She was becoming stronger, more calculating, and less willing to be a victim. It was on one of those nights when Alexander called her into his living room that the tension reached its peak. He was sitting in a leather chair, the soft light of the lamps casting shadows around his face. His eyes, ever watchful, were fixed on her. "You're acting strangely, Emily," he said, his voice low, almost bored. "I thought you were more obedient." She didn't back down. She wasn't intimidated. "I'm tired of being obedient, Alexander. I'm tired of being your puppet." The words came out with more force than she had imagined. For a moment, his gaze softened, but quickly closed again, as if he were trying to hide something. It was no longer the absolute control he had displayed before, but something more unsettling, a discomfort, an insecurity. He no longer knew what to expect from her, and that left her in a more powerful place than she had ever imagined. Alexander stood up, his face impassive, but the silence between them was heavy with something new. "Do you think you can escape me so easily?" he asked, his voice as cold as ice. "You're still in my hands, Emily." But Emily no longer believed that. She knew his control was still powerful, but now she was beginning to see through his masks. He was losing his grip, and she wasn't willing to be another victim in his manipulation game. Her resistance wasn't just a reaction, but a reflection, of what she had learned in the last few weeks. She was capable of more than she thought. The submissive woman who once accepted the bargain was now giving way to a determined woman who knew she could no longer live in Alexander's shadow. Later, Emily received an unexpected call. It was her father. His voice, now weaker but full of hope, made her realize the true importance of her struggle. He knew she was sacrificing herself for him, but Emily was beginning to question whether it was really worth continuing this game. What was she losing? Her dignity? Her freedom? She could no longer submit to a man who saw her only as a tool for his own interests. That day, Emily decided something needed to change. She would begin searching for alternatives, for solutions that didn't depend on Alexander's manipulation. But this decision wouldn't be easy, nor without consequences. With each step she took toward freedom, with each act of resistance, she knew things would intensify, but she was prepared to face whatever came. Her father, now beginning to improve, needed her, and she could no longer allow herself to be dominated by a man who had never treated her as an equal. What surprised her most was her own transformation. She was beginning to realize that she was no longer in the position of victim, but rather the agent of her own life. Every decision, every choice she made reflected a new Emily, a stronger, braver woman who wouldn't be afraid to fight for herself. She was no longer that frightened girl who had sold her opening night for a promise of salvation. She was now a woman who knew what she wanted and, more importantly, knew what she no longer wanted. When Alexander approached her the following morning, his expression was more closed off than ever. He had noticed the change in her, no doubt. But he could no longer control her in the same way. He tried again, with soft words and calculated gestures of affection, attempting to seduce her back into his web, but she was not fooled. She knew he was merely playing his game, trying to keep her submissive as he always had. "I'm not yours anymore, Alexander," she said firmly. "No matter what you do, it won't work anymore. I'm more than that. I'm more than what you think I am." He stopped, his expression freezing for a moment, but as always he quickly recovered. "You're going to regret this, Emily." But the truth was, she no longer cared. She had something far more valuable now, her freedom, her courage, and the determination to no longer submit. She was ready to face any challenge that came her way, because deep down she knew that no matter how strong Alexander was, she had become stronger. The mansion was in an unsettling silence. The grand house, which had once been Emily's gilded prison, now seemed like a silent battlefield, about to be invaded by a tumult of emotions and decisions that had been building up for weeks. Alexander still watched her, with an intensity that seemed to crush her. But now, Emily felt something different. He was no longer an unknowable threat. He was just a man whose lies she was beginning to understand. She was ready to face the consequences, whatever the price. Alexander's game was about to unravel. Emily was no longer that frightened young woman who surrendered to another's control. She was a woman who had discovered the power she had over her own life, and now she knew she had to act before he was once again responsible for her destruction. The change she had undergone had not gone unnoticed. The previous night, Alexander had tried to seduce her again with one of his subtle manipulations. He knew that somehow she still felt something for him. There was still a tenuous thread of desire, perhaps even a distorted form of affection, but that wouldn't be enough. He no longer had control over her. The words she had spoken to him the previous night echoed in his mind. "I am no longer yours." Now Emily was beginning to do something she had never imagined before. She was searching for answers. She knew that to truly free her father and end this cycle with Alexander, she would have to act more directly, with more courage. It was no longer enough to wait for an opportunity. She needed to create her own chance. Rebecca, her unexpected ally, was beginning to seem more like an enigmatic figure. Emily knew the woman knew more than she had revealed, and over time, she realized that the clues about Alexander were all around her. During the days she spent trying to figure out what to do, Emily began to connect the dots. Alexander wasn't just seeking revenge for his own past. He had an even greater goal. He wanted to destroy the person he had never been able to control, his own father. Rebecca, with her discreet observations, suggested that Alexander never actually wanted Emily's father's situation resolved. He was more interested in the manipulative power it gave him, and how he could use it to make Emily succumb even further to his control. What seemed like an offer of help was, in reality, just another part of his game. It had all been a charade. Conversations between Emily and Rebecca became more frequent. The woman, until then a distant figure, became a source of valuable information. Rebecca wasn't a friend in the traditional sense, but rather a fundamental piece in Emily's puzzle. Although she had a murky past with Alexander, she knew more about him than anyone else. She was the first to reveal Kellington's weaknesses, the flaws that Emily could exploit to finally turn the tables. It was time to confront the truth. Rebecca suggested that Emily look through the secret files Alexander kept under lock and key, records, documents, and contracts that could prove his personal vendetta and perhaps even some business trickery involving his father. Emily didn't know if she wanted to believe it, but she knew she could no longer trust Alexander's word. The need for freedom was stronger than ever, and her relationship with him had reached an irreversible point. That night, when Alexander went to the office, Emily went to the place Rebecca had indicated. The atmosphere was darker than usual, and the weight of the decision she was about to make made her breathing heavier. She knew that if she were caught, it would all be over. But the idea of continuing to be manipulated, of being a pawn in a power game that wasn't hers, made her go ahead. With trembling hands, she opened the secret door to Alexander's office. The room was filled with documents, but they weren't just papers. They were evidence, proof of manipulation, of blackmail, of a meticulously calculated strategy to seize control of her own father's company. The revelations left her stunned. Alexander was using her family's weaknesses as a bargaining chip, and his game of seduction and control had nothing to do with a simple power struggle. He wanted to be the one in charge of everything. Emily grabbed everything she could carry: contracts, exchanged messages, and even bank records. She knew this evidence was the key to finally turning the tables. Now she needed one last action to ensure that all of this wasn't just a twist of fate. But before she could leave, the office door opened. Alexander was back. Their eyes met, and for a moment he seemed to know exactly what she was doing, but there was something different in his gaze. It was no longer the calculated coldness of before, but a feeling of frustration, perhaps even anger. He knew she was about to finish what he had started. "Do you really think you can get away with all this, Emily?" he said, his voice tense. "Did you think you could fool me with your little maneuvers? You can't escape me." But Emily was no longer afraid. She held the documents firmly, the weight of her choice now evident on her face. "I've already escaped you, Alexander, and now I'm going to end your game." He took a step toward her, but Emily's expression was resolute. It was the final moment. The fight between the two was about to reach its climax. The room was shrouded in a menacing twilight, the only source of light coming from the lamp illuminating the corner where Emily stood. She felt the weight of the documents in her hands, as if it were her last chance to finally destroy the web of lies and manipulation that Alexander had created. The decision had been made, but something still made her hesitate. She knew that by taking the next step, there would be no turning back. She would have to confront not only the man before her, but also what he represented in her life: the control, the blackmail, the suffering. Alexander stood in the doorway, his eyes fixed on her. He already knew what she had done, but somehow he still believed he could manipulate her one last time. "Do you really think you can win this, Emily?" His voice was cold, but with an intensity that conveyed suppressed anger. He approached slowly, each step heavier than the last. "You're playing with fire. These documents, they mean nothing. I'm still stronger than you." But Emily didn't back down. She knew she was stronger now, that she had come this far because she believed in herself. Every obstacle he had placed in her path had shaped her, and finally she was ready to destroy the facade he had built around himself. "You were wrong, Alexander," she said, her voice firm and determined. "The truth is stronger than any manipulation you might try." He stopped in front of her, closer than she would have liked, but the feeling of fear he used to instill in her was no longer there. She no longer felt the same powerlessness as before. The woman he had tried to dominate was now, in fact, in control of her own destiny. "You really think you can take me down with that?" He laughed, but it was a humorless, empty laugh. "You're just a girl who's still trying to figure out how the world works." Emily wasn't fazed by his words. She looked at him, and for the first time saw the man he truly was, insecure, lacking control, trying to hide his own fragility behind a facade of power. He had never been truly strong. He had only built his strength on the weakness of others, and now she was crumbling it all. "I'm not a girl anymore, Alexander," she said without hesitation. "I'm a woman who knows what she wants, and I won't let you destroy any more lives, including mine." Alexander took a step toward her, but Emily stopped him with a firm hand. "You won't manipulate me anymore." She raised the documents, holding them above her head, a symbol of her struggle and resistance. "I know what you did, and now the world will know too. You will pay for your lies, for the way you destroyed the lives of so many people, including mine." Alexander looked at her with a gaze that mixed contempt and somehow respect. He had never imagined she was capable of getting this far. To him, she had always been just a piece in his game, a puppet he could control. But now he realized she had become something much greater, a woman who was willing to fight for her freedom and who was no longer afraid of him. He gave a bitter smile. "You think you have power now, don't you? But what you don't understand is that I always have a plan B, and you can't escape what I've prepared for you." The sentence cut through the air like a sharp blade, but Emily wasn't intimidated. She was ready. She knew that truth and her courage were more powerful than any plan he could have. But then Alexander did something unexpected. With a swift movement, he went to the table and picked up a phone. Emily watched him, unsure what to expect. He was trying to manipulate her once again, perhaps threatening someone she loved. But no. When he spoke on the phone, his voice was lower, as if he were playing one last card. "I will make sure your father is no longer a threat to me. The money you tried to hide, the truth you sought, it won't do you any good, Emily. I'm always smarter." His words were like a punch to the gut. Emily knew what he was doing. He was trying to use her father as a bargaining chip once again, but she was no longer willing to fall into his trap. By this point, she had already taken the final step. She had the power now. Without hesitation, she took the documents and placed them in front of him. "You lost, Alexander. No matter what you do, you can no longer control anyone." Alexander's eyes swirled with emotions. For the first time, he seemed truly defeated. His game was coming to an end, and he knew it. He no longer had control over anything, nothing left to manipulate. He no longer had Emily, nor the power he used to wield over everyone around him. She finally confronted him directly, and with one last look of disdain, she turned and left the room. She knew that in doing so, she had closed the chapter of her life with him, but more importantly, she had freed herself. The following days were a blur of revelations and adjustments. The truth that Emily had finally brought to light about Alexander and his manipulations had a profound impact on everyone around her. But for Emily, the greatest challenge was not how the world would react, but how she herself would face what came next. When the documents were handed over to the authorities and Alexander's crime network was dismantled, Emily felt a mixture of relief and emptiness. She knew she had fulfilled her promise of freedom, not only for herself, but also for her father, for everyone who had been controlled by him. The weight she carried seemed a little lighter, but the pain of the past weeks, the manipulation, and the constant feeling of powerlessness still haunted her. Alexander was arrested and lost everything: his wealth, his power, and his ability to play with people's lives. But, contrary to what many imagined, Emily felt no satisfaction at his downfall. There was a part of her that still felt compassion for him, though no longer for the person he had become. She didn't know if he would ever truly understand the consequences of his actions, but she no longer cared. She had to worry about her own life now. Her father, though still recovering, was improving every day. He knew his daughter had done everything to save him, but Emily no longer wanted to depend on him to feel complete. Their relationship was deep, but she was beginning to understand that true freedom wasn't just about rescuing others. Above all, she needed to save herself. The mansion where she once lived, a gilded prison, now seemed empty. Each room seemed to echo with the past, with all the memories of nights of blackmail and control. But she no longer feared that space. She was ready to truly change her life. Perhaps it was time to sell everything, to start a new life, far from the shadow of everything she had been through. As Emily gazed out the window of Alexander's office, where it had all begun, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. She no longer needed his manipulations or his false promises. She was no longer dependent on his game. The feeling of freedom, though unexpected, was now within her grasp. The phone rang. It was Rebecca. "How are you, Emily?" asked the familiar voice on the other end of the line. Emily smiled, feeling a sense of gratitude. "I'm okay, finally, free. I think that's it, Rebecca. I won. Not for him, but for myself." Rebecca laughed softly. "You always had the strength within you, Emily. You just needed to see it." The conversation was brief, but full of unspoken meaning. Emily knew that somehow she and Rebecca had become allies in something bigger than they imagined. Whatever happened to them in the future, Emily knew that true transformation came from within. The woman she had become was, finally, the one she was always meant to be, the master of her own life. She hung up the phone and looked out the window one more time. Dawn was breaking, and the world was full of new possibilities. It was time to move on, alone but free. Months had passed since her last encounter with Alexander. Emily now lived a peaceful life, far from the tension and shadows of her past. Her relationship with her father had strengthened, and she dedicated herself to new opportunities, seeking to build a future in which she had complete control over her choices. Her perspective on the world had changed, no longer as a young woman at the mercy of others, but as a woman who had achieved her own freedom. She didn't know exactly what the future held for her, but she knew she was ready for any challenge, free from constraints. If you were moved by Emily's journey and became as immersed in this story as I was, be sure to share your thoughts. What do you think about the fight for freedom and the strength of a woman facing the shadows of the past? Did she truly manage to break free? Or will control always haunt her in some way? Share in the comments and with your friends. Who knows, maybe this story will inspire others to face their own challenges and achieve their freedom too. Join the conversation and continue the reflection.